We're usually taught that America had two separate economic systems. The North had modern capitalism, banks, factories, commerce, and wage labor. The South had slavery. That story is convenient. It is also wrong. American slavery was not sitting outside capitalism waiting for capitalism to replace it. Slavery produced the commodities, investments, capital, credit, insurance, business, and raw materials that helped American capitalism grow. By 1860, 4 million enslaved people were producing cotton, tobacco, rice, and other commodities for international markets. Their labor generated about half of all American exports. Enslaved humans being themselves were valued at approximately $2.7 billion, more than almost any other form of property in the country. That was not a little side business. It was one of the central engines of the American economy. Cotton picked by enslaved workers supplied textile mills, merchants shipped it, banks financed it, insurance companies insured ships, crops, and enslaved people. Brokers sold people and plantation mortgages. Northern and European investors extended credit to plantation owners. Even businesses that never owned a single enslaved person profited from the system surrounding slavery. That is why historians increasingly describe this period as slavery's capitalism. The important question is not whether every plantation perfectly matches somebody's dictionary definition of capitalism. The point is that America's rise as a major capitalist economy cannot be explained without putting slavery at the front and center of it. Plantations were also more modern as businesses than we are usually told. Large plantation owners kept detailed records of output, labor assignments, food costs, and productivity. They measured how much cotton each enslaved person picked, compared workers against one another, and adjusted labor to increase production. They were participating in early forms of workforce surveillance, productivity measurement, depreciation, and scientific management, except the workforce was controlled through physical violence. Some of these practices appeared on plantations before they became common in northern factories. So when people picture slavery as just a lazy man sitting on a porch while everybody else works, they miss the larger system. This was organized production for profit. The plantation owner controlled the land, equipment, and workforce. Enslaved people performed the labor. The owner claimed the product and used violence to increase output. That is not separate from the history of American business management. It is part of that history. Then slavery was abolished in 1865. Which not so coincidentally is just 15 years after the first definition of capitalism was defined as the appropriation of capital by some to the exclusion of others. And this is where the story gets especially revealing. 4 million people were legally freed, but most were not given the land, tools, housing, or capital needed to become economically independent. Meanwhile, former slaveholders kept their land. President Andrew Johnson returned most confiscated Southern property to former owners, except ownership of the people themselves. So emancipation removed one kind of property, but left the underlying concentration of productive property largely intact with the slaveholders. The formerly enslaved were free in law, but most still had to survive by working land owned by the same people that had previously owned them. That helped produce sharecropping. Under sharecropping, a family worked part of a landowner's property in exchange for a share of the crop. The landowner or local merchant often provided seed, tools, food, and supplies on credit. Then, at harvest time, those costs were deducted. The owner generally controlled the books, and somehow, an astonishing coincidence, I'm sure, the worker frequently ended the year owing money. That debt tied families to the land and made leaving extremely difficult. The National Archives describe many formerly enslaved people as becoming trapped in a vicious cycle of debt peonage while working for their former enslavers. Sharecropping was not identical to chattel slavery. Sharecroppers had families, legal personhood, and some ability to negotiate or relocate. But economically, the plantation owner had solved an important problem. He no longer had to purchase the slave. He no longer legally owned the worker for life. He could retain the land, claim much of the crop, and shift more of the worker's food, housing, illness, and survival costs onto the worker. The owner lost legal ownership of the person, but preserved control over the property that person needed to live. And when debt was not enough, Southern governments used law. The black codes restricted travel, employment, and behavior. Black people without approved work could be charged with vagrancy. Some states required yearly labor contracts and punished workers who attempted to leave. A black person could be arrested for a minor or invented offense, fined an amount they could not pay, and then forced to work. That leads us to the exception written directly into the 13th Amendment. Slavery and involuntary servitude were abolished, except as punishment for a crime. That exception allowed governments to compel labor from people convicted of crimes. Southern states then developed convict leasing. States arrested people, overwhelmingly black, then leased them to private companies for work in mines, railroads, lumber camps, farms, and factories. The state collected money. The corporation received an extremely cheap and disposable workforce. And because the company did not own these workers for life, it had even less financial reason than a slaveholder to keep them alive. The racial transformation was immediate. At Alabama's penitentiary, the incarcerated population changed from approximately 99% white to 90% black within a decade of the Civil War. Prisoners were then leased to private organizations. The Library of Congress notes that private lumber and turpentine companies used convict labor to reduce labor costs, while black people were disproportionately imprisoned for minor offenses. The National Park Service described convict leasing as a source of both public revenue and private profit that helped rebuild the Southern economy. So follow the progression. First, the owner legally owns the worker. Then the owner keeps the land while the worker becomes trapped by crop debt. Then the state criminalizes the worker and rents them back to the private industry. Finally, the owner owns so much capital that every person becomes subject to the system of wage slavery. The legal form changes, the labor extraction continues. That does not mean wage employment is chattel slavery. Enslaved people could be bought, sold, separated from their children, and subjected to violence with almost no legal protection. We should never flatten that horror into a loose metaphor, but we should also stop pretending American capitalism is not still a form of slavery just because chattel slavery ended. The slaveholders never left, they just changed who and how they enslaved. Slavery accumulated the capital, slavery expanded the commercial networks, slavery influenced accounting and labor management, and when abolition threatened the labor system, property owners and governments developed new arrangements that preserved cheap, controlled labor without preserving every feature of chattel slavery. America did not move from slavery to freedom, it just changed the definition of free. It moved through slavery, black code, sharecropping, debt peonage, convict leasing, and prison labor, while ownership of the land and productive wealth remained heavily concentrated. The chain is not hidden. We were simply taught to look at each link as though it belonged to a completely different story. Perhaps the most ironic joke of capitalism is how it eventually convinced poor racist white people to compete for their place in the chains while thinking they were superior to the slaves they were trying to replace.